Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. The war in Ukraine will be over by May the 9th. That's the theory doing the rounds on the internet. Vladimir Putin wants to declare a victory that coincides with the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Most experts dismiss that date as a driver for Russian operations, but it does reflect a broader desire, probably held by both sides, that the war could be over within months. Our next guest says the conflict is more likely to go on for years. He's Fabrice Deprez, La Croix correspondent in Ukraine, and he's covered the region for many years too. Hello and welcome back, Fabrice.
Hi, nice to be back.
You're in Paris at the moment, but your job is to go back and forth. So you currently had you've had a spell in Kiev, and then now you're back in Paris. And I think you're due to go back again before long. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Ukraine. I landed in Ukraine 5 days before the war started. Then I covered almost the first 3 weeks of the war, came back, and now hopefully I'll go back to Ukraine in maybe a week or two.
Okay. We're going to get a broader analysis of where the conflict is headed in a bit. But just to start with, can you give us an update on what's happened in the past 48 hours? It seems like there's an important sort of second phase and shift here in Russian operations, which many people might be aware of, but I think it'd be good just to give a recap.
Yeah, it's interesting how clear it's been. I mean, first, Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky announced the sort of beginning of the battle for Donbass yesterday. But then Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did the same thing, said that the second phase of the military operation had started. So, for the history books, it's a very clear line that you can put there, after almost 2 months of what we could call the first phase, the attempt to win a quick victory, especially around the capital, which failed. And then we sort of had, I'd say 2, maybe 3 weeks during which Russian forces pulled back from the north of Ukraine first, then started rebuilding, gathering up, building up around Donbass. And now it looks like they are starting again to try to seize at least the entire territory of Donbass, which is the territory that the self-proclaimed and Russian-backed separatist groups are, claiming. They still haven't seized Mariupol, which I think they were sort of planning on first, being done with Mariupol and then starting the battle for the rest of Donbass, because, seizing Mariupol would allow them to free up a lot of troops, would also give them that symbolic victory that I think they're still looking for. As you said in the introduction, I don't think they're actually planning to end the war by May 9th. I don't think that, in part because they actually took the time to build up forces near Donbass, at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So if they were in such a hurry to end the war by May 9th, which is pretty soon, I don't think they would have done that. But I do think they want some kind of victory. They want to showcase something. And, seizing Mariupol, which has been associated with the Azov regiment, Azov unit for a long time, which is sort of the one, when you talk of denazification, that's like the main thing in Russian propaganda that you can see. So being able to announce the capture of that city, that would be a big deal propaganda-wise for them. But now they're starting, at the very least, to seize those 2 oblasts of Lugansk and Donetsk. And I think the main theory among military experts now is that they want to do some kind of envelopment to destroy the Ukrainian units which are located there and which have been there since 2014, which have the most experience, which usually got the best equipment. So they are really the best of the Ukrainian military. So the plan, it seems, for the Russian military is to sort of, get them in a big encirclement, either simply in Donbass, or there is also the more ambitious idea where they would try to basically converge on the city of Dnipro from the south and from the north, which would be a much more ambitious task. And I'm not sure the Russian military is really up for it, but that would be the huge envelopment with the same goal of destroying the Ukrainian military there.
We should have a map at this stage, but we don't, but I think people are probably familiar with it. There's that sort of bulge in the east of Ukraine. You've got Kharkiv, the northern end of it. And if you take a line going straight down, you come to the Donbass area,
Yeah,
and the Ukrainian troops are, so there's a sort of almost like a sort of salient in there, and the idea is that the Russians are going to overwhelm those forces there. I do think it's worth recapping as well some of the strategic and military failures that the Russians had at the beginning of this campaign, and that they need to overcome in order to execute this sort of this part that's taking place now. There's a new Russian military commander. Previously, they had different command centers in the north and the east and the south. They all now come under one commander. You follow this very closely. You're following it hour by hour. You're reporting it, and you've reported on the region for a very long period of time. What's the sense of both what military analysts say they need to do in terms of joining those operations up, and what the expectation is, whether they can actually deliver? I mean, I'm thinking of the communications between the different, whether it's land forces, aircraft, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, they had a ton of problem. You mentioned, the issue of coordination. I think that was an issue that was at really all level, like military experts have pointed out, the lack of close air supports, where you could see Russian military columns of military vehicles that was sort of advancing without seemingly any kind of air support, even though the Russian jets were flying in the air, Russian helicopters were flying as well, though they were getting shot down as well. But there was an almost impressive, really, lack of coordination. The worst example of this, and frankly still incredibly puzzling, was on the second day of the war, when a column of Russian, not even tanks, of Russian military vehicles entered into Kiev, like literally into the city, and were completely alone. There were no artillery preparation, there was no air support. They entered, were promptly destroyed, and still a mystery to me how that decision came to be, but I think it really exemplifies the complete chaos of really the first days and even the first weeks of the Russian operation, which I think now is pretty clear was driven by completely unrealistic objectives. The idea of just seizing Kiev in a few hours, worst case scenario in a few days, and the fact that they didn't put enough resources into that objective. They were really, they bet it all on this operation of Russian paratroopers seeing those military airports and hoping that would allow them to, drop in more soldiers and then quickly seize the capital. And that was a massive risk, which did not pay off. And then that led to the second massive mistake, which I think is still there, not a mistake that you can solve easily, which was the mistake of assuming that that Ukraine as a state was sort of, ready to crumble, and that it just needed a little pinch and everything would just fall down by itself, because it was a state that was just in a puppet in the hands of the Americans, that Ukraine doesn't really exist anyway. I think this whole operation was really driven by Putin's view of Ukraine. And I don't think that view has changed that much. I think probably in the Kremlin, the idea is more to focus on the Western support and to explain the failures by that Western support rather than by the resilience of the Ukrainian military, of the Ukrainian society, which is why, by the way, they have mentioned the possibility of striking Western support, Western weapons, if they're being brought in. And that will remain a problem. On the other end, it's pretty clear that many of the things that the Ukrainians were able to do in the first weeks of the war, which was to take advantage of those Russian mistakes, and on a more tactical level, in the north of Ukraine, you had those woodlands, those marshlands, which were ideal for those ambush tactics that the Ukraine used, and used in part with those anti-tanks weapons that they got from Germany, from the US, from United Kingdom, to really great effect. And that's going to work a lot less in the south of Ukraine, which is a lot more flat, a lot more prone to sort of classical warfare with heavy use of artillery, which Russian military does well, unfortunately, which the Ukraine military does as well. I think we've not seen as much of it, but they used it to pretty great effect in the south of Ukraine, in particular to near the city of Nikolaev, where they've managed to hold on Nikolaev, which was attacked by the Russian forces, and that was mainly apparently using pretty classical military tactics, including heavy use of artillery. But they might face a shortage of equipment, which is why they've been asking for artillery for tanks from the West. Whereas the Russians maybe have the opposite problem. I think it was Michael Kaufman, expert on the Russian military, who said that the Russians have the equipment, but they may soon lack the manpower because they've suffered tremendous loss in this first month. They haven't been willing yet to call full mobilization, which some expect around May 9th. Maybe Putin will announce full mobilization by then, but that doesn't happen then. That hasn't happened yet. And yeah, now they sort of short on manpower already.
Just to recap on that, so that area, we've traveled in that area. It's vast open landscapes, huge sort of agricultural areas, just enormous farmland, and then some pretty big, industrial cities. I mean, Dnipro is one of them. Obviously further away. So it's very different, as you say, from the landscape to the north. I'm going to pick you up on what you're talking about, conscripts and the recruiting of Russian forces. I mean, one of the great things that you're known for is that you do monitor quite obscure sources on the internet in Russian, and Telegram channels, and obviously Twitter. And obviously a lot of people are following these things now. What have you noticed more recently? I'm thinking in particular about how Russian reactions to recruitment. So if they're short of soldiers, what are they actually doing?
Yeah, I think it's been one of the most obvious thing when you look at footage either from social media or even Russian state TV, as on their daily evening news program, they publish a lot of reports from Mariupol, from eastern Ukraine, about what they call the liberation of Donbass, and so you can actually see footage of the Russian military in action. But also they show a lot of footage of separatist groups, of the military of separatist group in action, because that's the narrative, that they are liberating that region. And it's extremely obvious, and I think even to the Russian viewers probably, how poorly equipped those separatist units are compared to the regular Russian military, which is pretty modernized and pretty well equipped. And there have been footage, there have been videos, selfie videos made of those conscripts from those separatist groups, which have literally said, we're being used as cannon fodder. We are given no equipment, we're given no artillery, we're just being sent there to die. Which I've also heard military experts say that that's actually probably indeed what's going on. It's not just an isolated, complaint that because Russia is sort of sensitive about those losses, which have already been huge, and most of those soldiers in those separatist areas, they are, or at least they were, Ukrainians. So they don't count, if I can put it that way. Most of them have received Russian passports in the past few years, but they still won't appear in the Russian statistics. So many expect that they indeed will be used as cannon fodder. Maybe where you have a situation where you have like heavy artillery barrage on the city, then you first send the separatist soldiers, and then you send the actual Russian soldiers to sort of finish the job.
Later in this series, we are going to have more military analysis, so we won't go down that route too closely. But can we talk a bit more about Russian attitudes to the war within Russia? And I mean, obviously, we see We presume there are high Russian death tolls. We hear about, for example, the cruiser, the Moskva, being sunk. So from our perspective, and Russia's had to retreat, so it looks pretty abysmal. But what do you think the reality is? What are Russians actually saying? And what sort of fascinates me is I think Ukrainians calling their relatives back at home in on the other side of the border. Obviously, the Russians on both sides of the border, and the contact between the two. What are you hearing?
Yeah, it's been. I think first, I think it's really hard to say, actually what Russian as a whole feel about it, because I think a lot of them have sort of shut it down since, since the war, where you had this sort of apolitical stance that became even stronger. Like, I don't want to hear about it. Like, that's not. I saw recently this Russian regional media in Siberia, which was doing, a vox pop. Just asking people on the street what they thought about the war, and you had this, I think, very typically Russian reaction, which was to say, this is politics. I don't really know about it. Like, who am I to say? I don't know. Which is, a classic sort of evasion tactic. But it has to be said that there seems to be a lot of Russians who actually support the war as they see it. So they see it as this, denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. And as, Ukraine was supported by NATO, was about to pretty much to attack Russia. So that was like a defensive war. So they completely follow this narrative of the Kremlin. But what you mentioned and what I think is incredible, because I've really had that happen many times to talk with Ukrainians who said that they were in touch with relatives in Russia who completely rejected what they were telling them. And this is really something that I've heard many times. And first, without really asking about it, like completely unprompted, they were telling me, I have a brother, I have a cousin in Russia. And then when I told them, like, they're bombing Kiev, they told me, no, you must be wrong. Like that must be the Ukrainians bombing themselves just to make it appear. Or they would tell them, well, yeah, we're bombing Kiev and it's your own fault because you bombed Donbass in 2014 and you let Nazis take power. So really you should have seen it coming. And it seems very common, at least, and it's completely anecdotal. It's been my and I wrote a piece about it. I talked with a few people about that, but it really seems to be a common experience. And when you can passively sort of take in the Russian propaganda, but in that case, it's people who actively reject another point of view from their own relatives. So it's really strong.
And at the same time, we're seeing lots more funerals of Russian soldiers, often special forces, and they're obviously being treated as heroes, and that's the strong narrative. But here and there, you are finding cases of relatives who are saying, what's happened to my son? He was a conscript. I didn't know he was going there, where nobody's telling me what's happened to him. And there's one example of I think he's a cook on the Moskva who's disappeared. Now, we obviously hear about these in Western media, and it's certainly there on Twitter, but it's difficult to say how much traction that's getting within sort of Russian public opinion.
What I can say, because in the past 2 weeks, I think I've started trying to follow really closely news about Ukraine in Russian regional media. And it's actually quite staggering, the amount of just short reports, but about, local soldier who was killed in Ukraine and will be buried on that day. And it does not end. It keeps going. It's really all the time. And it's sort of incredible because for now, it still seems to be accepted quite well, even though, the comparison I always have in my mind is with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which had about 13,000 Soviet soldiers killed in 9 years. And right now, the estimation for how many Russian soldiers were killed in Ukraine are, I think the lowest is 7,000. The highest is the Ukrainian 20,000. So we can say at least 10,000. That seems like a fair estimation, which would be that in a bit more than a month, they got nearly as many soldiers killed as in Afghanistan in 9 years. And, the war in Afghanistan was a huge traumatism for Soviet society. It was sometimes described as one of the reasons for the fall of the Soviet Union, for the loss of trust into Soviet Union from the population. And well, of course, it's a long-term process, so it's still too early to talk about that.
At the moment, we would see that all that is caught up in this sort of message about sacrifice. You know, here the nations of pulling together. And the thing that really strikes me is this sort of Soviet nostalgia. We see the red flag, the hammer and sickle on some of the tanks. And for those who've come with us on our tours to Russia in the past few years, they will have seen on May 9th the enormous parades with tanks and Smersh and Buk missile launchers. And there's this huge parades of military material alongside the orange and with the orange and black ribbon of St. George portrayed quite prominently. And that now, in retrospect, this all seemed to be heading in one direction. I guess that's said with hindsight, though.
Yeah, it does. But yes, it really seems like, that there's been a preparation. And I don't mean in the sense, I don't think Putin was planning to invade Ukraine for the past 10 years. But still that this militarization of memory, militarization of, the sacrifice of World War II, of you mentioned it, those huge parade and, people showing like pictures of their relatives, which became this sort of massive, really massive event. And actually in some regions, these past few weeks, there were some calls for relatives of soldiers killed in Ukraine recently to show their relatives into those May 9th events, which is really astonishing. But yes, it does feel like, years and years of propaganda around World War II, but not only has sort of prepare Russian society to accept and even embrace this.
The comparison I think of is we have Poppy Day, a Remembrance Sunday in the UK, and the feelings that we have about the First World War and that sacrifice made by our generations have gone beforehand. It's as though that's being tied up into a current day conflict. I want to turn on to another point, and that's about the Russian media, state media, and how has that become? How are they explaining the sacrifices, and what is their approach to Ukraine now? I mean, it's obviously quite evident now that cities are being bombed, that large numbers of people are being killed, and by that, evidently civilians.
Yes, the Russian media is completely hysteric. I don't think I can put it any other way. And surprisingly, is actually more hysteric than I would say than Russian officials. Then you can see how the Kremlin talks, how Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, how it talks about the operation. They're being a lot more careful. Whereas when you watch actual Russian TV, it's extremely bombastic. It's extremely obviously patriotic. It's against NATO. Many, many references to World War II. The last one I saw in this, you have this TV show on the Russian main TV channel called Novosti Nedeli. It's on Sunday. It's like the news of the week, where they made those long reports. And they had this headline, which I think they put several days in a row actually, which was "Our cause is just," which in Russia makes a direct reference to the first speech that a Soviet official made after the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, which was not made by Stalin, actually, it was made by Molotov. And he ended his speech with "Our cause is just, we will win." And so here they're applying it to the Donbass conflict, and they've actually reframed it. In the first few weeks, it was the special military operation in Ukraine, usually said to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Now you can see that they focus entirely on Donbass. They don't really talk even about Ukraine as a whole. It's all about liberation of Donbass, usually tied in with denazification and demilitarization. But clearly, you can see how the goals have shifted, even in the official propaganda. Now it's pretty much all about Donbass.
And the evening talk shows. I don't know if people have seen Channel One, the main Russian media channels. They have chat shows, but it's like watching CNN. Yes. You've got talking heads. and they almost compete to make even more aggressive comments about the conflict. And so there's a sort of a continual flow of reinforcing a sort of, a pretty horrific agenda, which brings me to the question about war crimes. I mean, on one of these chat shows, somebody was saying, look, there was a report, and it was a news show. It was a reporter who was saying, look, we need to show Mariupol because the Ukrainians and the West need to realize we're going to flatten this, and they don't accept what we need to do. We're going to flatten Lviv, and we're going to flatten Kharkiv, and we're going to flatten Kiev as well. So my question that follows this is that I want to look at the nature of the conflict on the ground, and I don't know if you've got any judgment about the targeting of civilian, things like hospitals, schools, and also just the civilian population in general. Mm-hmm. Do you see that? I mean, I'm asking you for your sort of personal opinion here. Do you see that as a deliberate tactic, or do you think this is just the way the Russians operate?
Yeah, it's a really, really important topic, especially since I do think it's a deliberate tactic. When it comes to, well, the thing is, okay, you have the bombing of cities, the indiscriminate bombing of cities. Yes, I do think that's a tactic. First, because as I said before, the Russian military is really, it's all about artillery. That's that's what they know. That's their hammer. So everything is a nail, and so they will tend to bomb everything. Beyond that, there is also the fact, they've opened humanitarian corridors. They've been bombing people. I think also as a way, you get civilians to leave, and then you can just bomb without any problems. Then you have the more specific war crimes, what we've seen in Bucha and in other liberated Ukraine village, which here I'm more hesitant about. I think it speaks more of, lack of discipline and maybe just soldiers being, soldiers that realizing that they're failing. I'm not entirely convinced about the genocide narrative. That being said, you mentioned those talk shows, and the rhetoric on those talk shows is really scary. It is really scary, and it's rhetoric where they will tend to say that Ukraine as a state should not exist, and that basically all Ukrainians, anyone who claims to be Ukrainian, who is proud to be Ukrainian, is a Nazi, and you cannot rehabilitate Nazi, you can only destroy them, so you need to destroy Ukrainians. And it's hard not to see this as a sort of genocidal rhetoric. So I think I don't remember who mentioned it, the concept of pre-genocidal rhetoric.
Yeah.
Which I think sort of applies here, even if what we've seen on the ground, I'm not sure it can really qualify as genocide.
Yeah. The general Russian poet, is it Brodsky, who's the Russian poet who won a Nobel Prize for literature? And I think there's a poem he wrote in 1991, which clearly claims that Ukraine is not a nation and shouldn't be considered a nation. And it talks about when the Ukrainian takes his last breath, he'll be quoting Pushkin and not a Ukrainian national poet. But that's not to say that genocide was thought in 1991. It's you're seeing a lot of reiteration of that kind of propaganda. And it's a very strong message. Can we come back to, how you see things developing in the next few weeks and months? And everyone, as you're watching, please do put your questions down in the Q&A box, so I can start. I can see one question coming up, but if you can add to those questions, that'd be great. How long? What can the Russians hope for in this offensive, and where would that lead to? At best, as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, I think the sort of the logical thing, the thing you can see as most likely, even though in this conflict really nothing likely has really happened, but what you would see in the next few weeks and the next few months would be the Russians making gains in Donbass and in southern Ukraine, probably slowly, probably not as quickly as they would hope. but it's difficult to imagine right now the Ukrainians managing to stop them, and or even to to manage to counterattack and to push them back. It's hard to imagine them pushing them back to the borders of before February 24th. It's even harder to imagine them pushing back before 2014. Not even mentioning Crimea, because that's yet another issue. So I think the question is, when does Russia decide that they've gone far enough and that they can start negotiations? Because it will end in negotiation one way or another. There won't be capitulation either by Ukraine or by Russia. So there will be negotiations. And here the big problem is that both Russia and Ukraine need Donbass and need southern Ukraine, and neither Russia nor Ukraine will be willing to give up on it. Well, maybe
and
Russia
surely,
can give
Fabrice,
up on
even if the Russians pull, have some kind of ceasefire, the Ukrainians are not going to agree to demilitarize, which is what the Russians would like them to
of course.
do. And in the interim time, surely they're going to get more and more sophisticated weaponry. So, there's no short way out.
Yeah, there's really no short way out. I think there is a possibility, and even probably a decent likelihood, of a ceasefire in the coming month being decided. But neither side will recognize this as being the end of the war, because again, right now it will be all about who has actual sovereignty over Donbass. And if Russia agrees to give Donbass back to Ukraine, that would be a defeat. There would be no other way. I said earlier that they've switched the narrative, that now it's all about Donbass, all about the liberation of Donbass, and it's been about that for already 4 or 5 years, even longer actually. So they cannot just give up on Donbass. That would be a huge defeat. And I think I don't know who said that, but said that Putin wasn't afraid of actually doing war on Ukraine, but he is afraid of a defeat, and that defeat could have really terrible consequences for his regime. So he's not going to give up on Donbass, and Ukraine is not going to give up on Donbass either, because maybe you could negotiate around Crimea, because Crimea is already gone. Combined with security guarantees, maybe, but Donbass would be really too much. I think that's
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very good discussion so far. Let's bring in a first question. Jim Lowenstein. Go ahead, Jim.
Am I?
Yeah, you're there. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Putin keeps talking about Nazis in Ukraine. Western media never mentions anything about Nazis. What is the story on, for example, the Azov Battalion, which for years has been known as having had neo-Nazi origins? I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. How much fire is there in this charge that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis?
I'm going to just give you one anecdote, which is there's a bookshop in downtown Kiev where you can get books that basically celebrate Ukraine's German allied battalions, and basically find stuff celebrating. Well, you can even find copies of Mein Kampf as well. So there's no doubt in my mind, in the follow-up of the Maidan revolution, there were lots of very right-wing groups, and many of those went to go and serve in Donbass. Fabrice, you know far more about this than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to focus on Azov, Azov was created by this group called the Patriots of Ukraine, which was a neo-Nazi group from, by the way, from Kharkiv, which is kind of interesting because Kharkiv is a very Russian-speaking city, and it's actually sort of a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism and even Ukrainian neo-Nazism. So it was created by an outright neo-Nazi. It was very much neo-Nazi at the start, and it's still very much a far right, ultra-nationalist.
And didn't his best friend go to the other side?
Yeah, because of course he was a Ukrainian neo-Nazi, so of course he had very good contacts with Russian neo-Nazis, and Russian neo-Nazis didn't go the same way. So that happened. Azov is absolutely, a radical ultranationalist. They've sort of toned down the neo-Nazi rhetoric in the past years, but they still have their logo, which is very much neo-Nazi. They have a political party which does terrible, but which still exists. And I've seen experts claiming that Azov has depoliticized recently, which I think is completely wrong. I mean, they literally have a political party. They have not depoliticized. They are still radicals. So they exist. They exist for sure. You mentioned the books about German allied Ukraine groups in World War II. That's also sort of a big issue, I'd say, the memory of World War II. There's, by the way, that is common, I think, to most of Eastern Europe, where you had groups that sort of initially welcomed the German as liberators, and where those groups were involved in exaction. In the case of Ukraine, it was mostly against the Polish population and Jewish population. They participated in those Ukrainian pro-independence group. They participated in the Holocaust. All that being said, and of course it's a really big topic, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but all that being said, the Russian narrative that those Nazis are in control of Ukraine, as in, they are making the decisions and they are saying how things are being run, is wrong. They exist. They have some sort of influence in terms of, especially in terms of in the street. You've seen many cases of those far-right groups sort of beating down on activists, on especially LGBT activists, that kind of stuff, and always doing it with impunity. They never had any trouble from the police because Ukraine is still a fairly corrupt country. So they exist. They are a problem, and I've had many disagreements with people who say that it's a completely fake, problem, and there is no far-right problem in Ukraine. I think it is a problem. That being said, it's not on the level that Russian propaganda will put it. They don't make the calls in Ukraine. They are still a really, really big minority. A really small minority, a powerful one in terms of, they have weapons. And they are ready to use force. So they are a problem, but they do not control the country. They do not control Ukraine.
Okay. Thanks for that question, James. Go on. Let's take a question from Andy Mendes. Go ahead, Andy.
Thanks, Nicholas. Fabrice, you talked a lot about Ukraine, and certainly the rhetoric in the UK at the moment is all about brave Ukraine. But I guess at some point, the end game is not a Ukrainian decision. It's really a decision by Biden and by NATO in discussion with Russia, with Putin. And I wonder whether you think at that point, the Biden Western European view is that maybe Donbass is a price worth paying to get out of this nasty, messy, economically damaging war, and that Ukraine would be left, or the remainder of Ukraine would be left to hang out to dry.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a real possibility in the sense that, I can very much imagine people in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, feeling that if the only price for going back to peace is, a Donbass region that anyway hasn't been in Ukraine control for 8 years already, to actually give it up. I'm sure many in the West would be sort of happy to take that deal, but I'm not so sure, as you say, that the decision is, only Biden or Boris Johnson's to make, because what I can tell you is that in Ukraine, if a Ukraine president, because it would have to be, even if it's informally Biden who makes the decision, it would still have to be formally the Ukraine president to agree to it. And politically, that would be political suicide in Ukraine, and that would probably trigger, mass protests. I talked about those radical groups. They would 100% be against it. I've talked already right now with Ukraine soldiers who say that, they were opposed to any negotiations, and giving up on that would absolutely not be accepted by Ukrainian society, and I think that would destabilize the country hugely. So I don't see this as a realistic prospect, mostly for that, because I think it would be it would be a disaster inside Ukraine and would make things worse.
And I guess, Fabrice, also there's a calculation to be made, within NATO. And if you take Putin now more seriously than you did before this war, perhaps you don't want him to get away with it. I mean, I think Andy is suggesting that realpolitik dictates otherwise, but I think there'll be many countries that will be saying he can't be seen to win.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's also that now, and yeah, I think now there is I'm not sure. It does seem like there is a feeling of being all in. That either, and there is also right now a very common feeling that nothing will truly be able to be solved as long as Putin is still in power. I mean, Biden said it out loud, even though it was sort of walked back after that. But it was a very common feeling in Ukraine for many years already. I think it's now becoming a pretty common feeling in the rest of Europe as well, which might be a mistake, because I think there is this idea that after Putin, that the problem is Putin, and after Putin things will be all right. But of course, Putin could name a successor that will carry on with his views or something. Like, it's obviously not a guarantee that Putin leaving power in any way, in one way or another, that would solve anything. But it is nevertheless an idea that I think is becoming more prominent.
And it's certainly, because coming back to what we were saying about Russian attitudes towards the war, Russian attitudes towards Ukraine, this is not all entirely dependent on Putin. This has been encouraged over a long period of time, and it's not as though Russia's going to suddenly embrace democracy overnight.
I think this does speak to many people expected in the case of a war that the Russian elite would sort of crack, that you would see dissension, and we have not seen that at all. The Russian elite has sort of, on the contrary, has sort of strengthened around Putin. And you've even seen some pretty well-known Russian foreign policy analysts. I'm thinking of someone like Dmitry Trenin, which wrote for the Carnegie Center of Moscow, who was sort of considered a sort of moderate Russian analyst, and who recently has gone full in, supporting the conflict and supporting Putin in that. So yeah, the idea of the Russian elite sort of cracking around that, for now at least, doesn't seem to hold.
So what's happening with sanctions then? I'm particularly struck by the irritation of Russia's central bank at having half its reserves frozen abroad. What impact are you seeing? I mean, both in terms of the currency, but also in terms of supplies and in the shops and on the economy overall. And then thirdly, what impact does that actually have on the war itself? And if you're thinking about supplying troops and having weaponry, what evidence are you seeing about all those three things? So there's the currency, there's the economy, and then what impact is it having on the war?
That is a very good question. Here I will fully admit my limits, that on economic matters I'm not exactly the best, but I think one thing to keep track of, there have been tons of reports about Western companies sort of closing operations in Russia, which I think might have been in many cases very, very temporary, or very, sort of stopping operation in Russia, but having people in Central Asia doing the same job online. And I think you have a lot of those Western companies that still actually work in Russia. That being said, the effect on the level of the Russian people has been very clear and very, very strong. But one problem is that, in a way, Russians have been living in a situation of economic stagnation for a long time. Russians have been living with sanctions for a long time as well. So this is sort of more of something that they already know. So, the idea that they would sort of turn against the government because of that, in many cases, apparently it's been the contrary. It's been, it's fed a sort of victimization narrative of, see, we're being attacked by the West. But in another way, they were already sort of used to it. So it didn't have, the really strong impact that you might expect.
I think it's interesting that there's two contrasting perspectives. You could either look at the war in Afghanistan and see how corrosive that was, and that was accepted to be a major problem. But by Brezhnev, and then was it Andropov who pulled them out? I can't remember if it was Brezhnev or Andropov.
Right, I think it was Andropov.
Yeah, who pulled them out. So that's the sort of example of how if you've got soldiers dying in the tens of thousands, it might cause policy to shift. The other example I think of is Iran, and the Iran-Iraq war went on for 8 years, and actually that was a major consolidating theme within Iranian society. The sacrifices, the revolution had to make these sacrifices because the West was backing Iraq, and they just had to fight against them for survival. And really, that really solidified it. An ideology of support behind the new state, which was a huge break with what had come beforehand. Andy, you're a good cynic, so you don't believe the West is going to hold with this, do you? Andy Mendes.
No, I think the economic consequences, the consequences of all the migrants and such like, will just grind the Western public opinion down. And I just think, we look at Syria, and we were all up in arms about Syria, and this must never be allowed to happen. Now it's all accepted, and we've moved on, as we have in Libya and lots of other places. Now I know Ukraine's a bit closer, but I just think that the public opinion will say, for goodness sake, we're chucking arms at this thing. We're not. It's not British people.
Just out of interest, Andy, what was your attitude to the war in Bosnia, for example?
To be brutally frank, I think I was still working, and it just passed me by. So It was quite a long way away. I never was quite sure where Bosnia was. So it happened. I'm probably one of the better informed in those days working people, but not long way off.
Right, got it. Okay, and Fabrice, that comes back to attitudes in Germany and their less than wholehearted support for sanctions. Is that something you obviously follow that in Ukrainian media and follow Ukrainian comments on it? How bitter are they about that?
No, they are very bitter against Germany, France as well. Really, the two disappointments for Ukraine, I would say. Very bitter, very angry, I'd even say, and in a situation where of course, obviously in Ukraine, emotions have been heightened quite a bit. So there have been mentions of people being sort of annoyed by Zelensky's declaration, well, especially towards the president of Germany. But in Ukraine, it's being completely supported, and people think that Germany should definitely do more, because reference to Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 2 has been a topic in Ukraine for a very, very long time, and yeah, people really feel, if I can put it like that Germany owes them this support.
And the essential feeling is they just want to protect their living standards and their comfortable life while people are dying.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Richard Murphy, you got a question. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, just on nuclear weapons, that they were talked about quite a bit at the beginning of the war, the risk of them used as part of taking over the whole of Ukraine. But actually, has the warfare, how it looks like it's going to pan out, changed enough that it's very unlikely that Russia would use nuclear weapons, and what might bring them up again?
So Fabrice, there is evidence that they are using some weapons that they've used in Syria, which people have been very controversial. There's talk about use of chemical weapons. I just wonder, that some of this stuff has been, rung alarm bells already.
We still don't have credible evidence of use of chemical weapons. There have been, I think, credible reports of use of thermobaric weapons, which are those weapons basically destroying oxygen around you, and so like making everything implode, which are horrible. There have been reports of use of phosphorus, not many, but there have been a few of them. But I think in many ways the destruction has been done with old school
So
artillery.
the question, I guess, then is the threat, the great worry from NATO or NATO nations is that we can't get involved. If we do, there's a risk of nuclear war. So that's one question. And then the next question is, would Putin use tactical nuclear weapons to achieve his aims? So he didn't do it in Kiev. He perhaps could have done. Might he do it elsewhere? So what kind of commentary do you see on that?
Yeah. I think the West has said very clearly, and even recently, even the past few days, they've still been very clear, and I think it's understood by everyone that the West is not going to send soldiers, actual soldiers, to Ukraine. And yeah, because as you said it, I think the main worry is nuclear escalation. In terms of use of tactical nuclear weapons, I mean, of course, that's like the worst case nightmare scenario. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the Russian doctrine, the use of nuclear weapons can be used in case of threat to the safety of the actual state, the survival of the state.
They changed it last summer, and so it's initially it was the threat of the state, basically an existential use.
Right.
But they changed their military doctrine last summer, where it applies to them or their allies. So it's got a much looser. I think it's a political message that's been given to the West ahead of this conflict. Possibly that's one of the interpretations, anyway.
And I don't think they would. I don't think they would do it, if I'm honest. But I think also that when last year we were debating the possibility of Russia invading Ukraine or not, the main consensus was that Russia, and Putin in particular, would only do that if they were completely mistaken about Ukraine in general, about the possibility of achieving regime change in Ukraine, about the possibility of actually securing a country as big as Ukraine, about being welcomed with flowers and salt and bread by the Ukrainian population. And Russia made those massive mistakes in their initial assumptions, which I think speaks to the growing irrationality of Putin, which you could see, in this article in the summer, which I think you could see even more clearly when he made his speech announcing the recognition of the separatist territory and then announcing the war. When you had in 2014, you had like a sort of proud Putin announcing the annexation of Crimea, and in those more recent speeches, he was sort of sit down. He looked tired. He looked like someone who's really, really bitter. He looked extremely bitter. And so I think, he's not really fully rational anymore. I don't think he's crazy or anything, but I think he truly, truly believes what he says about Ukraine, not being a real state and being sort of a NATO puppet. And he truly believes that it is an actual threat to Russia. And so I think he could take drastic measures. I still don't believe he would go that far, but I didn't believe he would invade Ukraine. So,
No, absolutely. Fabrice, what I'd like you to do is list some of the people you follow. If people are, Twitter and Telegram, this is perhaps a horrific thing to observe, but if you do go on Twitter or you do go on Telegram, there are sources that you can watch that provide, in some cases, pretty graphic and live details of the war, which you perhaps don't want to see. But there's also a lot of military analysis. There's a lot of strategic analysis, political analysis that is really useful. I follow a guy called Michael Hoffman, and I'm hoping to get him on this program next month if we can. Haven't had a reply yet.
Great.
Yeah, he's fantastic. There's another chap who works at King's. He's doing a PhD called Rob Lee. He's very good on the actual sort of military material and strategy, whereas Michael Hoffman's more on the overall strategy overall. Fabrice, who do you recommend, other people you follow?
So yeah, I would say these are the two big ones. And then you also have the more, I'd say, tactical accounts, if I can put it like that. You have this account called Ukraine War Map, which publishes every day, updated maps of the situation. Also Ukraine Weapon Tracker, which publishes footage of destroyed vehicles And you actually have this blog whose name I forgot, but that actually keeps account of visually confirmed destroyed Russian vehicles, which has been sort of the most reliable count we can get on Russian losses, because, of course, probably Ukraine sort of inflates the total losses of the Russian military, and of course, Russian military downplays it. So we have this blog which does a visual count, and I think it's really precious to get a sort of good idea of at least the bare minimum, because of course what has been visually shown to be destroyed is lower than what has actually been destroyed, but it still gives a good idea.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, we will send out some of those Twitter handles and feeds so people have got a copy of them with the recording of this video. Andy Mendes, last question from you, please.
Yeah, okay. I've been accused of being a cynic about the Western, the stamina in the West. So an open question to you, Fabrice. How do you think this war will end, and when, perhaps?
Yeah, good question. I'm starting to think, though I'm still constantly questioning those assumptions, but it seems to me that a Korean scenario is sort of becoming, more and more likely with a ceasefire, with neither side sort of recognizing that this is the end of the war, but a ceasefire that keeps going for a long time. I'm not entirely sure about it, because I think it would be really hard to keep such a front line quiet, the way it's mostly been in Korea for the past decades. But I also see that, as I said, Ukraine is not going to give up on Donbass. Russia cannot give up on Donbass. So there is a possibility of the situation sort of more or less freezing again. Unless, of course, Ukraine manages to actually push back the Russian military, into their borders, which would be a massive achievement. From what I've talked to with military experts, seems unlikely. Even if they get massive Western support, just holding the line would already be a pretty big achievement. But there have already been a lot of surprise in this war, so I wouldn't exclude it entirely.
So in an earlier parallels in the war in Yugoslavia, Croatia was initially pushed back. The Serbs took eastern Slavonia, which is an area just alongside the Serbian border on the the right on the eastern edge of Croatia, and they also took the northern top of Bosnia. So they had a strip running along the top of Bosnia, and then to the east of Croatia. There was the end of that conflict was really in '92, but then in '94, I think it was '94, the Croatians used that interim period to retrain their forces and to basically re-equip their armed forces, backed by the Americans. And there was Operation Storm, and they took back that land within a very short period of time. So the parallel, for me, really is if there is a ceasefire, it's only going to be one in which both sides try and restock in order to do a better job next time around.
And both sides will be aware that the other is using the time to restock and get ready to start again, which will make any ceasefire incredibly fragile, which makes the Korean scenario sort of also unlikely, because of course the threat of the Ukraine military will still be there for Russia. So all that talk of demilitarization of Ukraine and everything that will still have to happen.
It's a pretty grim thought, because if we think about a Cold War, post-war, this is really this is a hot war. This really isn't a Cold War at all, and this is the one that's going to, the way we're looking at it now, could possibly go on for years, without one side being able to really hammer the other. And Russia's huge, and when's Ukraine going to win?
Yeah, it is extremely grim.
Fabrice Deprez, thank you very much indeed. It's another great discussion. Really enjoyed your time.
Pleasure again.
Save your time in Paris. Hope you get some more time off.
Absolutely.
And good luck when you go back to Kyiv.
Thank you very much.